The Duke of Norhope had crossed the threshold of his wife's chamber perhaps 4 times in 6 years of marriage, and never once had he found the door standing open the way it stood open now, with the grey afternoon light spilling across the boards and Olwenna kneeling before a leather trunk. Folding her linen into it in complete silence, she did not weep, she did not look up. She lifted each garment as though it were a page she was closing on a book she had already read to its end, and she laid it down, and she smoothed it flat with the side of her hand, and the small sound of that smoothing was the only sound in the whole of the west wing. Osmer stood in the doorway and could not make his voice work. He had come to tell her something trivial. He no longer knew what. Some matter of the household, the tenants, the frost that had come early to the low fields, one of the 100 cold and useful sentences he had spoken to her across a length of table for 6 winters, sentences that required no answer and received none. He had knocked, and the door had drifted inward under his knuckles, unlatched, and he had seen the trunk, he had seen her hands, and every ordinary thing he had meant to say had gone out of him like breath in cold air. "Olwenna," he said at last. She did not startle. That was the thing that reached him first, before the trunk itself, before the meaning of it, that she did not startle at his voice in her doorway, that she had grown so accustomed to being unregarded that even his sudden presence could not move her. She only finished the fold she was making, a plain grey shawl he did not remember ever having seen her wear, and set it against the others. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "I did not expect you before evening. What is this?" It was not a question. It could not have been made into a question. The trunk was open, the drawers of her press stood empty, her small hairbrush and her comb, and the little enamelled box her mother had left her were already wrapped in a handkerchief on the coverlet. He knew the shape of a departure. He had watched his own mother's things carried out of this house when he was 9 years old, and the memory of it rose in him now with a violence he had spent 30 years learning to suppress. Olwenna sat back on her heels and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him. She was 26. He had married her when she was 20, a Netherby of no great fortune, a match arranged between his late father's man of business and her uncle across a single afternoon, and Osmer had signed the settlement the way he signed everything in those days, without lifting his eyes. He had a memory, if he searched for it, of a girl in a travelling cloak in the great hall, pale and trying to smile, and of himself walking past her to answer a letter about the drainage of the East Marsh. 6 years. He had let 6 years pass, and he had not once truly looked at her face until this moment, and now that he looked he saw that she was beautiful, and that she was tired, and that she was entirely, immovably resolved. "I am going to my aunt at Millbrook," she said. "Her companion has died, and she has asked for me. I mean to leave on Thursday, with the carrier if you will not spare the carriage, though I hoped you might spare it. I did not think it worth troubling you until the arrangements were settled." A small pause. "They are settled now." "You are not going to Millbrook." "I am, Your Grace." "For how long?" And there it was. The question he had walked straight into without seeing the edge of it, the way a man in fog walks off a stair. She did not answer at once. She looked at him with a steadiness that he would remember for the rest of his life, a steadiness that had no cruelty in it and no plea in it either, only a great and settled quiet, like the quiet of a room after a clock has stopped ticking and one realizes it has been stopped for hours. "I think you know," she said, "that it will not be a visit." He should have argued. A duke argues. A duke commands. The Duke of Norhope had bent magistrates and mortgages and men twice his age to his will with a lift of one dark brow. But he stood in his wife's doorway with the grey light on the floor between them, and he found he had nothing to command with, because to command a thing one must first have some right to it, and he understood, standing there, that he had never once behaved as though he had any right to her at all. He had housed her. He had clothed her from his accounts. He had passed her in corridors and inclined his head as one inclines it to a portrait, and she had folded herself smaller and smaller through 6 years of it until she had folded herself, at last, into a trunk. "You are cold in this room," he said. It was the most foolish thing he had ever said in his life. But he had noticed, suddenly, that the fire was not lit, that the grate was swept and dark, and that his wife had been kneeling on bare boards in an unheated chamber folding her clothes to leave him, and something in the wrongness of the cold undid him more than anything her mouth had said. Olwenna glanced at the empty grate as though she had long ago ceased to notice it. "Betty does not always remember the west rooms," she said. "It is a long way for the coal. I did not like to make a trouble of it." "You did not like to make a trouble of it," he repeated. "No, your grace." He came into the room. He had not meant to. His feet carried him. He stopped a careful distance from the trunk, as though it were a thing that might close on him, and he looked down into it, the folded linen, the grey shawl, the worn edge of a prayer book, a pressed sprig of something brown and long dead tucked into a fold of paper, so little, so unbearably little to show for 6 years as the mistress of one of the great houses of the north. She had taken nothing that was his. He saw that at once, and it shamed him past speaking. No plate, no jewel, none of the Norhope pieces that were hers by every right of her station. Only her own small poverty, folded neat. "The Aldermer sapphire yours," he said, hoarsely. "The pieces in the strong room. Whatever you leave with, you will not leave with this. This is nothing." For the first time something crossed her face, not anger. He could have borne anger, but a flicker of something gentler and more terrible, a kind of pity. "They were never mine, your grace," she said. "They were the Duchess of Norhope's. I only wore the name. I should not like to take what belonged to her." "You are Duchess of Norhope." "Am I?" she said. Not bitterly. She said it the way one reads aloud a sentence in a foreign tongue, testing whether it means anything, and finding that it does not. Then she turned back to the trunk and lifted the next thing to be folded, and by that small motion she told him, more plainly than any speech could have, that the conversation was finished and that he was, as he had always been, free to go. He did not go. He crossed to the cold hearth instead and knelt. The Duke of Norhope, in his riding coat, knelt on the swept stone before the empty grate of his wife's chamber, and he began, clumsily, with hands that had not laid a fire since he was a boy, to build one. There was kindling in the box and coal in the scuttle dry, untouched, as though someone had prepared the room, and then forgotten there was a person in it who might be cold. He set the kindling in a lattice the way old Marsh the gamekeeper had shown him 30 years past, and he struck the flint, and it did not catch, and he struck it again. Behind him the folding had stopped. He did not turn to see her face. He was afraid to. He struck the flint a third time, and the kindling took, a small yellow tongue of flame that climbed and steadied, and he fed it, and he did not speak, because he did not trust the thing that was rising in his throat. He had not wept since he was a child. He was not weeping now. There was a pressure behind his eyes and in his chest that he had no name for, and he understood, kneeling there feeding sticks to a fire in a room he had never troubled to enter, that he was afraid, that the Duke of Norhope, who feared no man, was mortally afraid, and that the thing he feared was the closing of that leather lid. "You need not do that," Olwenna said quietly behind him. "I shall be gone in 3 days. It is not worth the coal." "It is worth the coal," he said to the fire. Silence. The flame chattered and grew. He held his hands to it, though they were not cold, because he did not know what else to do with them, and because as long as he tended the fire he did not have to stand up and face the trunk and the truth of it, which was that his wife had decided to leave him, and that he could think of not one honest reason she should stay. When at last he rose and turned, she had folded the grey shawl a second time, needlessly, and her hands were still upon it, and she was looking at the fire he had made with an expression he could not read, not gratitude. It was too old and too worn for gratitude, but something like a person looking at a thing they had wished for so long ago that they had forgotten they had ever wished it, and were now uncertain how to feel to see it granted too late, and by the wrong means. Why now, he heard himself ask. 6 years. Why now? Olwenna was quiet for a long moment. When she answered she did not look at him but at the small brave fire. "On Tuesday," she said, "you passed me on the great stair. I was carrying the accounts down to Mr. Harrow, and I stood aside to let you go up, and you said thank you." She smoothed the shawl. "You said it the way you would say it to a footman who had opened a door. You did not know me from the footman. And I stood on the stair afterward, and I thought, I am 29 in 3 years, and I have made myself so small in this house that my own husband thanks me as he would thank a servant, and does not see that anything is owed, because to him nothing is." She lifted her eyes to him at last. I was not angry, your grace. That is what frightened me. I have stopped being angry, and I thought, if I stay until I am no longer even able to be sad, then there will be nothing left of me at all to take to Millbrook. So I had better take it now, while there is a little of it left. The fire snapped. Somewhere far below, a door closed and a servant's feet crossed the flags and faded. Osmer of Norhope stood in the middle of his wife's cold room, before a trunk that held the whole of what he had let her become. And for the first time in a very long life of getting his own way, he did not know how to begin, only that he must, that if he let Thursday come and go with the same silence he had spent 6 years perfecting, he would deserve every empty year that followed. And that some part of him he had thought long dead had woken, kneeling at that grate, and was not going to let him be a coward now. "Do not answer me tonight," he said. His voice was rough and low. "I have no right to ask you for anything, and I know it. But I ask you for this one thing, and only this. Do not leave on Thursday. Give me a little of the time I have wasted, a fortnight. Then, if you wish it, I will drive you to Millbrook myself, and I will not say a word against it, and you shall have the sapphires, and the carry, and everything that is yours, and I will trouble you no more." He drew a breath that shook. "A fortnight, that is all I ask." Olwenner looked at him for a long, long moment, and he understood that she was weighing not his words but the whole of 6 years against them, and that the words weighed very little. "Why," she said softly, "should a fortnight be different from 6 years?" And he had no answer that he had yet earned the right to give, so he said the only true thing he had. "Because I am asking," he said. "I have never once asked you for anything. Let this be the first." The fire burned. She did not close the trunk, but she did not fold anything more into it either. And when at last she inclined her head, the smallest motion, barely a yes at all, he felt it strike him harder than any blow he had taken in the field, and he went out her room walking very carefully, as a man walks who is carrying something that has, without warning, become the only thing he owns. He did not sleep. Osmar lay in the great dark bed that had been his father's and his grandfather's and stared at the canopy, and for the first time in years he made himself count backward through the marriage instead of away from it, and the counting was a kind of penance. He had married her in the second winter of his grief. That was no excuse, and he knew it for none, but it was the truth, and he had spent so long refusing to look at the truth that he owed it now at least the courtesy of naming it plainly to himself in the dark. His brother Aldous had died in the October, thrown from a horse he had been warned against, and their father had followed him before the spring, more from the breaking of his heart than from the lung fever the physicians wrote upon the certificate, and Osmar, who had never expected the title, who had been the second son, the spare, the one permitted to be difficult, had come into Norhope at 29 with a black band on his arm and a hole in the middle of him where his family had been. The lawyers had said he must marry. The estate wanted an heir, the name wanted continuance. A suitable young woman of good blood and modest expectation had been found. He had agreed to it the way a man agrees to a course of unpleasant medicine, and he had gone through the wedding with his mind 3 counties away in the churchyard where they had put his brother, and he had brought his bride home to Norhope, and then, quite simply, he had forgotten her. Not forgotten that she existed. He was not a monster. He did not tell himself he was a monster. That would have been another kind of vanity. He had provided for her. He had been, in the frozen way of a man who has decided never to feel anything again, so that nothing can ever again be taken from him, correct. He had housed her, funded her, been civil to her at table. He had simply never once permitted her to become real to him. Because to let her become real was to let her become a thing he could lose. And Osmar of Norhope had buried everything he could lose in 2 consecutive winters and had resolved, somewhere beneath the reach of thought, never to be so foolish again, and Olwenner had let him. That was the part that turned in him now like a knife. She had not raged, she had not wept in the corridors, she had not made herself a grievance. She had watched him decide she was furniture, and rather than fight it she had, with a dignity that appalled him now, simply become as small and quiet and undemanding as furniture, so as to trouble no one, so as to be no burden, so as to give the cold man she had married nothing further to freeze against. 6 years. He tried to remember a single conversation of substance he had held with her and could not. He tried to remember the colour of her eyes and found, to his horror, that he had to reconstruct from the afternoon just past. Grey like the light on the floorboards, grey and clear and very tired. In the morning he did a thing he had not done in 6 years. He waited for her at breakfast. She came down at her usual hour and stopped in the doorway of the small parlour when she saw him there, for he was never there. He broke his fast in the estate room over his correspondence, and had done so for as long as she had lived in the house. She recovered herself and came in and made her curtsy and moved toward her own place at the far end of the table, and Osmar rose, which startled her again. He saw it, the small flinch of a person unused to being risen for, and he said, "Will you sit here? Nearer. I find I cannot hear you from the length of the room." "You have never wished to hear me from any distance, your grace," she said. But she said it gently, without spite, stating a plain fact, and she sat where he had indicated because it was less trouble than refusing. "That is true," he said. "It is one of a great many true things I intend to say to you, and I would rather you did not spare me any of them." She poured her chocolate and did not look at him. "What is the purpose of this? You gave me a fortnight. I gave you the courtesy of not correcting your arithmetic." She set down the pot. "Your grace, I am not a fortress to be reduced by a siege of politeness. I know what a siege is. I have lived inside one for 6 years, only the walls were on the inside. If you mean to spend 14 days being kind to me so that I will feel it ungracious to leave, then I would ask you as one weary person to another not to. Let us part as we have lived, quietly, and I will remember you without unkindness." It was the longest speech he had heard her make in the whole of their marriage, and every word of it was reasonable, and it struck him that her reasonableness was the most damning thing about him, that she had been reduced to defending herself against his kindness. Having learned that in this house kindness came with a hook in it, "I do not want you to remember me without unkindness," Osmar said. He stopped. He was not a man who finished sentences he had not planned, and he had planned none of this. "I do not know yet what I want, and I will not insult you by inventing it neatly. But I know it is not that. Not to be a fond grey memory you are relieved to have escaped. That is worse than being hated." He put his hands flat on the cloth. "Tell me one thing, and I will let you eat in peace. In 6 years, was there ever an hour you were happy here?" She was quiet a while. Outside the window the rooks went up off the elms in a black scatter and settled again. "There is a bench in the walled garden," she said finally, "under the south wall, where the piers are. In the second summer I used to take a book there in the mornings before the house was awake, and the wall held the warmth, and for an hour there was no one to be small for, and I could be myself, whoever that is. I was happy on that bench." She turned her cup a quarter turn on its saucer. "You had the piers cut down in the 3rd year to make room for the new stabling. I understood. The horses wanted the ground, but I was sorry about the bench." She looked up, and there was no accusation in it, only that terrible mildness. "You asked. I'm answering honestly, as you wished." He remembered the piers. He remembered signing the order for the stabling, and never once, not for a heartbeat, considering that anything grew in that corner that a living person loved. He had cut down his wife's one happiness to widen a stall, and she had said nothing, and he had never known, and he might have gone to his grave never knowing. "I did not know you sat there," he said. "No," she agreed. "You did not know I sat anywhere." There was nothing to say to that. He let her eat. He watched her discreetly over the rim of his own cup, and he saw 100 small habits of a person who has taught herself to take up as little room as possible. The way she kept her elbows in, the way she thanked the maid twice and softly, the way she ate quickly as though half expecting to be told she was wanted elsewhere. 6 years of a woman making herself into a shadow, so as not to disturb a man too grief-frozen to notice she was there. He had done that. Not a villain, not a tyrant, only a coward with a coronet, and the difference had made her life, and the difference was smaller than he had ever let himself believe. That afternoon he went to find Mr. Harrow, his steward, in the estate room, and asked him a question he had never in 6 years thought to ask. "The Duchess," he said. "What does she do with her days?" Harrow, a careful man who had served the family since Osmar's father's time, set down his pen with the slow deliberation of a servant deciding how much truth his master can bear. "Your Grace wishes the honest answer, or the comfortable one? When have I ever wanted the comfortable one from you? Then, your grace, the Duchess runs a great part of this house and half the parish, and has done these 5 years, and takes no credit for any of it, because she believes credit would be presumption. Harrow drew a ledger toward him and opened it. The winter coals for the almshouse cottages. She pays for those from her own pin money and has Betty carry them so no one will know their source. The widow Cade's boy at the grammar school. The fees come from her. When the fever went through the low village 3 springs past, and your grace was in London for the session, it was the Duchess who nursed in the cottages herself, against my strong advice, and who sat up 2 nights with the Marley twins, and who never once mentioned it to you, because she said you had cares enough. The linen for the church, the physic for the poor, the reading she does to old blind Mrs. Thorpe every Friday of the world. Harrow closed the ledger. Your grace asked what she does with her days. She has been the Duchess of Norhope with her whole heart, your grace. She simply has not troubled anyone with the fact of it, least of all yourself. Osmar stood very still in the estate room where he had signed away his wife's Beatrice, and he felt the ground of his self-regard, such as it had been, go out from under him entirely. Why did you never tell me, he said. Because, your grace, said Harrow, not unkindly, you never once asked. And the Duchess bade me not to, she said. The old man hesitated. She said you had made a peace with the world by not looking at it too closely, and that it was not her place to disturb your peace. Those were her words. I have carried them 3 years and been ashamed of my part in them every day. He went out into the grey afternoon and walked, without deciding to the corner where the piers had been. New stabling stood there, sound and useful and warm, full of the breath of good horses, and there was no trace of the bench or the wall warmth or the 1 hour of the day in which his wife had been permitted to be a person. He stood in front of it a long time. Then he turned and went back into the house and up the great stair, the stair on which he had thanked her as he would thank a footman, and he knocked at her door, and this time he waited until she bade him enter before he opened it. She was at the window with her mending, and the trunk still stood by the wall, not full, not empty, its lid still open like a question no one had answered. I have been to see Harrow, he said. He did not come further than the threshold. He had not earned the room. He has told me what you have done in this parish for 5 years, and what you forbade him to tell me, and why. His jaw worked. I came to say that I am ashamed. Not gracefully, I have no grace for this, but truly. You have been the best thing this house has had in a generation, and I let myself believe you were a quiet nothing at the end of my table, because a quiet nothing was easier to live beside than a person I might have had to feel something for. He made himself hold her eyes. You were right not to be angry any longer. I would only ask that you be angry now a little if you can find it. It would be easier to bear than your kindness. Alwynna set down her mending in her lap, and for the first time since he had found her at the trunk, something moved in her face that was not resignation, a brightness at the eyes quickly mastered, but he had seen it, and it was not indifference, and the discovery that she was not indifferent, that under all the folded-away quiet there was still something in her that could be reached, went through him like the first warmth after a long cold, painful and welcome at once. I do not want to be angry, Osmar, she said, and it was the first time in 6 years she had spoken his name, and the sound of it in her mouth stopped his heart as surely as the trunk had. I only want, for once in my life, to be seen before it is too late to matter, and I am very much afraid, she said, her voice at last was not even, that you are only seeing me now because I am leaving, that it is the leaving you cannot bear and not the loss of me at all. He stood in the doorway and knew that she had named the very thing he feared in himself, and that the only way he could answer it was not with words, of which he had spent 6 years being a miser, but with all the days he had left, and that a fortnight, suddenly, seemed a cruelly little while in which to become a man worth staying for. He began the next morning, not with grand gestures. He had a horror of grand gestures now, for he saw how a grand gesture would be only another way of making the fortnight about himself. But with the smallest and most ordinary things, the things a husband ought to have known and had never troubled to learn. He learned that she took no sugar in her chocolate, and had been served it sweet every morning for 6 years because no one had asked, and she had never liked to correct the kitchen. He spoke to cook. He learned that the west wing was always cold because the flue drew badly and had wanted sweeping since before the last Christmas, and that his wife had gone through 2 winters of it rather than trouble the household in a hard season. He had the sweep sent for that afternoon and stood over the man himself. He learned that she rose at 6:30, always, and walked in the garden before the house woke, and that she had done so every day even through the frost, in a cloak too thin for it, because the 1 hour before the house needed her was the only hour that had ever been her own. So on the 4th morning he rose in the dark and dressed himself without his man and went down to the garden and waited. She came out at her hour, cloaked, her breath smoking in the cold, and stopped when she saw him standing on the gravel path in the grey half-light. For a moment he thought she would turn and go in. Then she squared her shoulders. He was learning to read that small motion, the gathering of herself before an ordeal, and came on. "You do not walk before breakfast," she said. "I have not walked before breakfast in 6 years," he agreed. "I am told I have missed a great deal by it." He fell into step beside her, careful to keep a little distance, and they went along the frost-white path between the sleeping beds in silence for a time, and it was not the old dead silence of the dinner table, but a different thing, wary and new. The silence of 2 people who do not yet know how to be in one another's company but have, for the first time, agreed to try. "Tell me their names," he said, when they came to the beds. "I have owned this garden 30 years, and I do not know one flower in it from another. You know them all." "Teach me." And she did. Warily at first, then less so. She took him along the borders in the cold and named them, the hellebores that would come first, before winter had quite finished, the snowdrops already needling up under the wall. The place where the peonies slept that would be a foam of white and blush by June. The old climbing rose her predecessor, the last Duchess, had planted, that Orwenna had nursed back from a blight 3 years past and never mentioned. He listened. He asked questions, real ones, and she answered. And somewhere in the naming of the hellebores he understood that she had built a whole life here in the margins of his indifference, a rich and secret and generous life, and that he had walked past the windows of it for 6 years thinking the house empty. "You saved the rose," he said. "Harrow did not tell me that. Harrow does not know. It was a small thing. She touched a bare, thorned cane with one gloved finger. The last Duchess planted it. Your mother, I think. It is very old. I could not let it darn my watch. It seemed discourteous to her." She glanced at him. "I never knew her, but I have tended her roses and worn her name and slept in her house, and I have felt sometimes that she and I were the only 2 people in it. 2 duchesses that no one quite saw." She said it without complaint, an observation merely, and it was worse than any complaint could have been. They walked on. The house woke behind them, window by window, and neither hurried to go in. That was the shape of the days that followed, small, careful, real. He did not court her. He had the sense to understand that courtship was a thing owed to a stranger, and that he owed her instead the far harder thing of amends. He did not buy her jewels. He brought her instead a young pear tree in a wrapped root ball, and had it planted in the sheltered corner of the walled garden where the old one had stood, and put a plain oak bench beside it, and said nothing about it at all, only left it there for her to find. She found it on the 6th morning. He watched from the estate room window, not meaning to spy but unable to look away, and he saw her stop, and stand a long time before the little tree and the bench, and put her hand to her mouth, and he saw her shoulders move. And he understood that she was weeping, at last, over a pear tree, and did not go down to her, because he understood also that the weeping was hers and not for him to interrupt or to claim. At dinner that evening she said over the soup, "You planted a pear." "I planted a pear. It will not fruit for 4 years. Then I shall have to be here in 4 years to eat one," he said, before he had thought, and saw the words land, saw her go still, and did not take them back. "I mean it as it sounds, Orwenna. I know I have no right to speak of 4 years from now. But I find I want them. I did not know a week ago that I wanted anything. I have wanted nothing for 6 years. That was the whole of my cleverness, to want nothing, so that I could lose nothing. And it worked. I lost nothing. I only mislaid the one thing that was worth the risk and never noticed, because I had taught myself so well not to look." She set down her spoon. "Why did you teach yourself that?" And so, haltingly over the guttering candles, he told her, a thing he had told no one, not Harrow, not the physicians, not himself in any words. He told her about Aldous and the horse, and the way his brother had laughed at the warning and been dead before the leaves were down. He told her about his father in the last months, a giant of a man gone small and grey in a chair by a window, calling out for a dead son in the night. He told her that he had loved them both past his own understanding, and that when they were gone the grief had been so enormous and so total that he had made, somewhere below the level of choosing, a child's bargain with the world, that if he never again let anything become precious to him, then the world could never again do to him what it had done in those 2 winters. "So I made you not precious," he said. His voice was very low, deliberately, not cruelly. "I never thought of it as cruel, which is the shame of it. I thought of it as safety, but deliberately. You came into this house a frightened girl of 20 who had left her own people to marry a stranger, and you needed, at the very least, a friend, and I decided, so that you could never hurt me, that I would not let you be one. And you were too proud and too kind to force yourself upon a man who would not have you. So we froze together 6 years in a warm house." He looked at her across the little flames. "I am telling you this not to excuse it. There is no excuse. I am telling you because you asked me once why I could not see you, and you deserve the true answer, and the true answer is that I could see you perfectly well. I chose not to. It is the worst thing I ever done, and I did it to the person least deserving of it in all the world, and I did it out of cowardice dressed up as strength." The candles burned. Somewhere a log settled in the grate with a soft collapse. Olwenna was quiet for a long time, and when she spoke her voice was not steady at all. "Do you know," she said, "in 6 years, that is the first thing you've ever told me that was true. Not correct. Correct you've always been. True." She pressed her fingertips briefly to her eyes. "I could have loved you, Osmar. That is the thing I have never said and will say now, since we are saying true things. In the second summer, on that bench, under the piers, I used to think, he is not cold all the way through. I have seen him be gentle with a lame dog. I have seen him carry old Marsh's grandchild on his shoulder at the harvest before he remembered himself and sat down. I used to think if he would only turn round, once I could love him, and it would be a good marriage after all." Her mouth trembled and firmed. "And you never turned round, and I stopped waiting. It is a very particular death to stop waiting for someone. It does not hurt at the time. That is how you know it is finished. It stops hurting. And now?" he asked, and he had never in his life been so afraid of an answer. "Now," she said, "you have turned round. 6 years too late, and only I still have fear, because I reached for the trunk." She shook her head slowly. "I do not know, Osmar, whether a thing that has stopped hurting can be made to hurt again, whether a fire that has gone all the way out can be lit from the same wood, or whether one needs new wood entirely, and a new hearth, and a new house at Millbrook." She rose and gathered her shawl, and at the door she paused and looked back at him, and there was in her face something he had not seen there before in the whole of their acquaintance, not resignation and not yet hope, but the raw, uncertain place between them, which is the only ground on which anything can grow. "But I will say this," she said, "the pier was well thought of, better than sapphires. Good night, Osmar." She went, and he sat on alone among the dying candles, and he did not feel triumphant, for he had won nothing and knew it. He felt like a man who has been ill a very long time and has taken that day his first uncertain steps across a room, and stands swaying and amazed that his legs will bear him at all, and terrified, still, of the distance yet to cross, and of the door at the far end of it, marked Millbrook, that stood, for now, still open. The 8th day of the fortnight brought a hard rain out of the west, and with it, unlooked for, a carriage he did not know, splashed to the axles, that came up the long drive at an hour no honest visitor keeps. It bore Lady Pentreth, Olwenna's aunt's neighbour, and a woman of formidable connections and small charity, who had been travelling north to Millbrook and had, she announced, shaking her wet skirts in the great hall, made a point of breaking her journey at nor hoped to see with her own eyes whether the rumours were true. Osmar, coming down the stair, caught the word rumours and slowed. "For it is all over 3 counties, your grace," the lady said with the bright cruelty of a person who has ridden a long way to be the first with bad news, "that the Duchess is to leave you and go for a companion to old Miss Netherby, like a poor relation, like a governess. And I said, "It cannot be, the Duke would never admit his own one wife so talked of, there must be some mistake." She let the words hang, watching his face for the sport of it. "But here is her trunk half packed, I am told by your own people, and here is her Grace looking like a ghost, and here are you, your Grace, gone quite grey. So I see the rumour has the right of it after all. How very sad. How the Marchioness of Coombe will enjoy it." It was the kind of moment in which the Ozma of a month ago would have been magnificent and useless, would have frozen the woman with a look and a cold word and sent her back into the rain, and the incident would have become one more brick in the wall around him, and Olwenna, standing white and still at the foot of the stair with her hands folded, would have watched him defend his pride and understood, correctly, that he was defending his pride and not her. He did none of that. He came down the last of the stairs and he crossed to his wife's side. And he took her cold hand in his, the first time he had touched her in 6 years, and he felt her start at it, and he turned to Lady Pentreth and said, in a voice that carried to every servant frozen in the shadows of the hall, "You have been misinformed, madam, on one point only. The Duchess is not leaving me because she is a poor relation. The Duchess is considering leaving me because for 6 years I was a poor husband, and she was too good for the whole of that time to say so aloud. And if there is a rumour worth carrying to the Marchioness of Coombe, it is that one. That the fault at Norhope was the Duke's entire. You may say I said so. You may say I said it holding my wife's hand and wishing to God I had held it sooner." He inclined his head with perfect courtesy. "The rain is worsening. I will not keep you from Millbrook. Harrow will see your horses watered." "Good day, madam." There was a silence in the great hall so complete that the rain on the high windows sounded like applause. Lady Pentreth opened her mouth, found nothing in it worth the saying, closed it, and swept out to her carriage in a considerable temper, having ridden a long way to gloat and been given, instead, a confession she did not know what to do with. The door boomed shut behind her. The servants melted away, and Osmar found that he was still holding his wife's hand, and that she had not taken it back. "You should not have said that," Olwenna said. Her voice was unsteady. "It will be all over the county by Sunday. Let it. It is true, and I am tired of protecting a reputation I did not deserve at the cost of one you did." He looked down at her hand in his, small and cold, and very gently, as though she might break or bolt. He closed his other hand over it too, warming it between both of his. "I have spent 6 years guarding myself. I find I would rather spend the rest of them guarding you if you will let me, and I do not much care who laughs." She was trembling with cold, with the aftermath of the woman, with something else. "You are making it very hard," she whispered, "to keep to my resolution." "I know," he said. "I am sorry." "No, I am not sorry. It is the first thing I have set out to do on purpose in 6 years, and I find I am not sorry at all." She drew her hand back then, but slowly, reluctantly, and she looked up at him with her grey eyes swimming, and she said, "It is not the grand moments I doubt, Osmar. Any man may rise to a grand moment. It is a kind of vanity, even, to be splendid before an audience. It is the 6,000 small mornings I doubt. It is whether the man who held my hand in front of Lady Pentreth will still see me across the breakfast table in the 10th year, when the grief has healed over, and you no longer have anything to be forgiven for, and I am only, again, your wife. That is where you lost me the first time, not in any great cruelty. In the 10,000 mornings you did not turn your head." She pressed her lips together. "I do not know how a person promises that. I do not think a person can. I think one can only live it, and there is not time in a fortnight to live it." And he understood that she had put her finger on the exact and central difficulty, and that she was entirely right, and that no speech he could make would answer it, because the thing she doubted could only be disproved by years, and years were the one thing his fortnight did not contain. He did not sleep again that night, but this time it was not despair that kept him awake. It was that he had understood something, lying in the dark listening to the rain, and the understanding had the terrible simplicity of all true things. He had been trying, all this fortnight, to win her. To be worthy, to be splendid, to earn her back inside the 14 days as a man wins a wager. And that was still underneath the old vanity in a new coat, still about him, about his redemption, about the closing of the trunk before Thursday, so that he need not feel the loss of it. And she, who saw everything, had seen that too. There was only one thing he could do that was not about himself. And it was the last thing in the world he wanted to do, which was how he knew it was the thing. In the morning, grey and rain-washed, he came to her in the small parlour where she sat with her letters, and he stood before her and he said, "I release you from the fortnight." She looked up, startled. "What?" "I release you from it. It was a selfish bargain and I am ashamed of it. I asked you for 14 days to make myself worth staying for, and that made the whole of it a performance, with a curtain that falls on Thursday, and you were right to distrust it. Because a performance is exactly what our whole marriage was. I performing correctness, you performing contentment. Both of us frozen behind the mask of it." He drew a breath. "So I will not perform for you any longer. Here is the truth instead. The carriage is yours whenever you want it. Today, if you wish. The sapphires are yours, and a settlement that will keep you in your own establishment for the whole of your life, free of me, whether you go to Millbrook or take a house of your own, where no one has ever heard the name nor hope. You need never see me again. I have written to my lawyers this morning. It is all in train. You have only to name the day." His jaw was tight. He made himself go on. "I am not doing this to be admired for it. I am doing it because I have finally understood that loving a person and needing to keep them are not the same thing, and that for 6 years I confused the two, and I will not do it a seventh. If you are happier away from me, then I want you away from me, and that is the whole of what I want, and is the first unselfish thing I have felt in my adult life, and it is tearing me in half, and I would not have it otherwise." She had risen without knowing it. The letter had fallen from her hand to the floor. She stared at him. "You are letting me go," she said. "I am letting you choose," he said. "There is a difference, and I only learned it this week, and I learned it from you. For 6 years I gave you no choices at all. I chose your smallness for you, chose your silence, chose the length of the table between us. So this is the one thing I can give you that I never gave you before. The whole of it in your hands, with nothing owing, and no fortnight, and no siege. Go to Millbrook and be free of a man who did not deserve you, and know that he wishes you every happiness and means it, and will not trouble you." His voice cracked once, and he mastered it. "Or do not. But if you stay, Olwana, let it be a thing you chose in the full light of day, with every door standing open, not a thing I trapped you into with a pear tree and a pretty speech to Lady Pentreth. I would rather lose you honestly than keep you by a trick. I have kept you by a kind of trick for 6 years. I am done with it." And he bowed to her, formally, the deep bow one makes to a sovereign, and he turned and walked out of the parlour and left her standing there with every door open and the whole of her life, for the first time, entirely in her own 2 hands. And he went up to his study and shut himself in and sat at the window at the rain on the little pear tree, and he did not know, and had made himself not need to know, which way she would choose, and it was the hardest and cleanest hour he had ever passed. She went to Millbrook. She came to him in the study an hour later, having thought it through in the full light of day as he had asked, and she told him quietly that she would go, not in anger, she said, and not to punish him, but because he had given her, for the first time, a real choice. And a choice made in a warm house under the eye of a repentant husband was not, she felt, a choice made freely. She needed, she said, to stand somewhere he was not, and see whether what she felt was her own or only the pull of his sudden warmth. "If I stay now," she said, "I will never know whether I chose you or only surrendered to being wanted, which after 6 years of not being wanted is a very strong wine. I would rather go and be sure, and come back to you clear-eyed, if I come back at all, than stay muddled and wake in 10 years wondering." It was the wisest thing anyone had ever said to him, and it cost him everything. He had not to argue with it. "Then go," he said, "with my whole blessing, and my letters if you will read them, and the carriage, and the certainty that whatever you decide I will honor it." He rose and, greatly daring, took her hand and bowed over it and did not kiss it, only held it a moment against his brow, an old gesture of fealty of a knight to his liege. And she let him. "I will be here," he said. "That is the one thing I can promise that is worth the breath. Not that I will be splendid, that I will be here." He drove her to Millbrook himself 2 days later, through a countryside washed clean by the rain. And they talked more in those 6 hours on the road than they had in 6 years under one roof. And when he set her down at her aunt's modest door, He did not linger or make a scene, only saw her trunk carried in and bowed, and drove home alone through the early dark. And did not weep until the horses could not see him do it. And then he did the thing that mattered, which no one saw, and which was therefore the only true test of whether he had changed at all. He did not pine theatrically. He did not neglect the estate to prove his heartbreak. Instead, quietly, he took up her hidden works. All of them, every one that Harrow could name and several the old man could not, that Ozma unearthed by patient asking in the cottages where his wife's name was spoken with a love his own had never earned. He went to the almshouse himself and found the coals wanting and ordered them and paid for them from his own hand, and told the astonished old people that they came, as they had always come, from the Duchess, who was away but had not forgotten them. He rode to the grammar school and paid the widow Cade's boys' fees a year in advance. And on the Friday, the first Friday she was gone, he went, in some trepidation, to the cottage of old blind Mrs. Thorpe, and sat in the low dark room that smelled of wood smoke and camphor, and said, "Mrs. Thorpe, the Duchess is from home a while, and she would not have you go without your reading. Will you have me instead? I do not read as sweetly as she does, I am told, but I read loud, which may serve as well." And the old woman, who could not see that it was the Duke of Norhop himself, who had come to her hearth, reached out and found his hand and patted it and said, "Bless you, your grace, for I know your step. I have heard it these 6 years walking by door and never stopping, and I never thought to hear it stop. Sit you down. She reads me the Psalms of a Friday. You'll find her place." She folds the corner. He found her place. She folded the corner. He read the old woman the Psalms in the smoky dark until the light failed, stumbling over the harder words, and old Mrs. Thorpe corrected him kindly where he erred, for she knew them all by heart, and when he rose to go she held his hand again and said, "You've a good voice, your grace. Under the rust of it. She'll be glad you came. Tell her Nan Thorpe says she's to come home when she's ready and not a day before, and that we're keeping her, all of us, warm against her coming." And Osmar walked out into the dusk with his eyes stinging and understood that his wife had built, in the margins of his neglect, a kingdom of small love across this whole parish, and that he had been the only person in it who did not know her. He wrote to her, not every day. He had the sense not to flood her, not to make his letters a new siege, but twice a week, plain letters. No protestations, only the news of the parish and the small doings of the house, and increasingly the honest small doings of his own heart, which he had spent a lifetime keeping under lock and had begun clumsily to let out onto paper. He told her he had read to Mrs. Thorpe and made a hash of the 42nd Psalm. He told her the pear tree had put out 3 green leaves. He told her he had found, going through his father's old papers, a letter his mother had written before her death, and that reading it he had understood for the first time that his father too had frozen after her loss, and had frozen Osmar's whole boyhood along with him, and that he saw now he had inherited the coldness the way one inherits an estate, without choosing it, and had passed it on to his own marriage without ever once examining the deed. "I do not tell you this to be pitied," he wrote. "I tell you because I have spent my life explaining nothing to anyone, and I find I want you to know the shape of the man you are deciding about, all of it, the ice and the reason for the ice both, so that if you come back it is to a man you see clearly, and if you do not, it is a man you have refused with open eyes. Either is better than the fog we lived in." Her replies came slowly at first, and were short and careful. Then by degrees they lengthened. She told him of Millbrook, of her aunt who was querulous and lonely and, Olwenna suspected, not truly in one of a companion at all, but only of a niece to love, of the small grey town, and the sea a mile off that she walked to in the mornings the way she had once walked the garden. She asked after Mrs. Thorpe. She asked after the pear tree by name, and after the climbing rose, and told him how to prune it and when, and he went out with her letter in his hand, and pruned it exactly as she said, standing in the cold with her handwriting in one fist and the shears in the other. And it was the nearest thing to holding her he had. 3 weeks became 5. 5 became 7. The county gossip, starved of the scandal Lady Pentreth had promised it, turned to other bones, and those who had heard from her the tale of the Duke who had confessed his fault in his own great hall and let his wife go free rather than trap her, found to their surprise that they thought the better of him for it, which he had not intended and did not care about, for he had stopped somewhere in those weeks, living for the opinion of the county at all. He did not know if she would come back. That was the truth he lived inside now, and he found, to his own surprise, that he could live inside it, that the not knowing, which a month ago would have driven him back behind his old walls of ice, he could now simply bear, could hold like a stone in his pocket and go on with his day, because he had learned at last that the alternative to bearing loss was not safety, but a slow death dressed as safety. And he had tried that road for 6 years, and it had led him to a woman kneeling before a trunk in a cold room, and he would not walk it again whatever came. Millbrook was a small grey town that turned its shoulder to the sea, and Olwena's aunt lived in the last house of a terrace that looked over the harbour wall to the water, and it was there, in a narrow spare room with a sloping ceiling, that the Duchess of Norhope unpacked the same leather trunk she had packed in silence 3 counties away, and found that she had come in the end no further from Osmar than the reach of his handwriting. Her aunt, Miss Netherby, was 70 and sharp and lonely in the particular way of a clever woman who has outlived everyone who understood her jokes. She had asked for a companion. What she had wanted, Olwena understood within a week, was simply someone of her own blood to be irritated by and to love, and Olwena gave her both freely, and was glad of the giving, for it was easier to tend her aunt's small querulous wants than to sit alone with the great question she had carried north. They fell into a life. In the mornings Olwena walked to the sea, a mile down the cobbled hill and out along the harbour arm to where the water heaved grey and enormous against the stones, and she stood there in the wind that was nothing like the still walled warmth of the Norhope garden, and she thought, and did not hurry the thinking. She had told Osmar she needed to stand somewhere he was not, and see whether what she felt was her own or only the pull of his sudden warmth, and she found the standing harder than she had expected, not because she missed him, though she did, in a bruised, astonished way that she had not looked to feel, because the miles did not do what she had asked of them. She had thought that away from Norhope his newfound tenderness would thin and fade in her mind, and she would see it plainly for the deathbed penitence of a man frightened by an open trunk, and be free of it. Instead, the miles did the opposite. Away from the confusing warmth of his actual presence, with only his plain letters twice a week to go by, she could weigh the man more coldly than she had ever been able to weigh him across a breakfast table, and the colder she weighed him the heavier he came down. For the letters did not stop, and they did not turn to pleading, and they did not, week upon week, contain a single word designed to move her. That was the thing that undid her guard by inches. A man performing repentance, she knew, would have written her his suffering, would have painted his empty house and his sleepless nights, and made of his amendment a gift held out to admire and reward. Osmar wrote her that the sweep had at last cleared the west wing flue, and that the room she had frozen in for 2 winters would be warm now for whoever slept there. He wrote that he had gone to the almshouse and found the old people wanted more than coals, wanted company, and that he had taken to sitting an hour with them of a Sunday, and had learned more of the parish in 3 Sundays than in 30 years of owning it. He wrote that he had read Mrs. Thorpe the Psalms and made a hash of the 42nd, and copied out, in his blunt hand, the verse that had stopped him, as the hart panteth after the water brooks, and written beneath it only, I did not understand this verse before. I begin to. He never once wrote come back. She looked for it in every letter, half dreading it, for a summons would have let her refuse and been sure, and it never came, and its never coming was louder than any summons, because it told her that he had meant what he said in the parlour, that he had truly set her free, and would not tuck the leash even by so much as a wish committed to paper, and a man who could do that for 6 weeks, unwatched, with everything he wanted lying on the far side of one persuasive letter he declined to write. That was not a man performing. That was a man changed. You read those letters, her aunt observed one evening over their small fire, the way I used to read your uncle's, God rest the tiresome man, when we were courting, and I was pretending to myself I did not care whether he wrote. I am not being courted, aunt. No, said Miss Netherby, threading her needle by the failing light with the sublime rudeness of the very old. You are being married to, which is rarer and better and takes longer, and you have the great good sense to be doing it by post from 3 counties off, where you cannot be dazzled into it against your judgment. I approve. Your judgment was always the best thing about you, and everyone in this family has spent your whole life trying to talk you out of using it, myself included. Don't let them. She bit the thread. That husband of yours ignored you 6 years, you tell me. A wicked waste. But there's ignoring out of cruelty, which does not mend, and ignoring out of a wound, which sometimes does if the wound ever heals, and it seems it has begun to. The question is not whether he was cold. He was cold. The question is whether the thaw will hold through a cold spring, and that, my girl, no letter can tell you. Only years, which is a great pity, for I should like to see it settled before I die, and I do not mean to die inconveniently soon merely to spare you the wait. Olwenna laughed, and something in her chest ached and eased at once. You are the only person who has ever told me to trust my own judgment. Then everyone else was a fool, and I have said so at their funerals. Her aunt set down the mending and looked at her, and for a moment the sharpness gave way to something gentler and more searching. Do you love him, child? Not, did you, once, on a bench under some pear trees? You have told me that story, and it broke my old heart. Now, this grey autumn, the frozen man who has begun to thaw and writes you about drains and psalms and does not once ask you home. Do you love that one? And Olwenna, who had come 3 counties to be able to answer that question honestly, sat by the small fire with the sea sounding under the window and found that she could not say no. I am afraid to, she said at last, which was as near to yes as she could yet come. Well, said her aunt comfortably, taking up her needle again, that is love. The other thing, the thing without the fear in it, that is only being pleased with someone. You were pleased with him once on the bench, and it cost you nothing and came to nothing. Afraid is dearer. Afraid means there is something left to lose. I would trust the afraid one myself. But then I always did like a bad bargain that came good. And she said no more and let the girl sit with it, which was the kindest thing she did in all that long autumn. At Norhope, Osmar kept his word and did not come back, and it cost him more than she could have known, for the house without her had become unbearable to him in a way it had never been in 6 years of her quiet presence, which was, he reflected grimly, precisely the measure of his old blindness. That he had not felt her there until she was gone. The rooms she had moved through so softly for 6 years were loud with her absence now. He found himself learning her by the shape of the hole she had left. He would pass the small parlour and remember she was not in it. Would come down to breakfast and see the near place he had made her sit in empty. Would go out to the walled garden in the cold morning at 6:30, her hour, and walk the frost-white paths alone, naming the plants she had taught him, to keep them by heart against her coming, hellebore, snowdrop, the peony bed, the rose she had saved. He pruned the rose in the winter exactly as her letter instructed, standing in the cold with the paper in one fist, and it was the nearest thing to her hand he had, and he was not ashamed to admit as much to himself, for he had given up, that autumn, the long labour of being ashamed of feeling. He filled the emptiness the only honest way there was, which was with her work. He did not do it for her to hear of. He had learned that lesson, and Harrow's letters to Millbrook were the old steward's doing, not his. He did it because it wanted doing, and because doing it made him, by inches, into the man he should have been from the start, and because, though he would not have put it so boldly even to himself, tending the parish she loved was a way of tending her across the miles, of keeping faith with the whole invisible kingdom of small love she had built in the margins of his neglect. He learned the names of children. He learned which cottages had a sick old body in them and went to sit there. He paid the schoolmaster and the apothecary and the coal merchant, and did it quietly, and let the credit go as she had always let it go, to a duchess who was away but had not forgotten. And one grey afternoon, going through his late father's papers in search of a lease, he came upon the letter, his mother's, written in a fine faded hand a few weeks before her death, when Osmar was 9, and he sat down on the floor of the muniment room among the deed boxes and read it, and understood a thing about his whole life that he had never had the words for. And he took up his pen that same evening and wrote it, all of it, to his wife. His mother's letter had been written to his father, not to him, and that was why he had never seen it. It had lain 40 years in a deed box with the marriage settlements folded small. She had known she was dying. She wrote to beg one thing of the husband she was leaving, that he not, in his grief, close himself against their sons. You go hard and silent when you are hurt, my dear love, she had written, in the fine failing hand, and I have always known it for grief and forgiven it. But the boys are too young to know it for grief. They will only know it for cold, and think themselves unloved, and learn from you to go hard and silent in their turn, and so the thing will pass down and down. Do not let it. When you cannot speak your love, at least do not let them believe there is none. Turn your head to them even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. He had read it kneeling on the muniment room floor, and understood that his father had failed the one charge his dying wife had laid on him. Had gone hard and silent, exactly as she foretold, and frozen the whole of Osmar's boyhood, and taught him, without a word, that when you are hurt you close the door, and that Osmar had learned the lesson so well that when his own turn of grief came, he had done to his wife precisely what his father had done to him, and never once seen the pattern of it, because a man cannot see the water he was born swimming in. I do not tell you this to be pitied. He wrote to Olwenna that night, nor to plead that it was not my fault, for it was. A man of 40 may inherit a coldness, but he cannot blame his father for keeping it. I tell you, because you asked me once, at the dinner table, why I could not see you, and I gave you the true answer as far as I knew it then. Here is the truer one that I did not know until this week. I could not turn my head to you because no one ever turned a head to me, and I did not know it could be done, or that it was owed, or that a marriage was a thing you were meant to be present inside rather than merely correct beside. I know it now. I learned it too late to spare you 6 years, and I would not blame you for a moment if that were the end of it. But I wanted you to have the whole deed, the ice and the making of the ice both, because you are the first person I have ever wished to be fully known by. And being fully known is a thing I spent 40 years too frightened to risk, and I find, writing to you across 3 counties with nothing left to lose, that I am not frightened of it any more. That is your doing. Whatever you decide, that is your doing, and I am grateful for it, though it should undo me. That letter she did not answer for a long time, and when at last she took up her pen she found she could not write the thing she felt, and set it down again, and wept a little by the sea instead, and knew that she had her answer, and had had it for weeks, and was only still too proud and too frightened to commit it to the post. The county, meanwhile, had done a thing the county rarely does, which was to change its mind. Lady Pentrith had carried north the tale she meant for scandal. The Duke who let his Duchess leave him, but she had been made, in that great echoing hall, to carry with it the other thing, the confession. The fault is the Duke's entire, said aloud before the servants, with his wife's hand in his, and though she told it to wound him, it did not, in the retelling, wound the way she wished. It is a strange fact of the world that a proud man's public humbling of himself, done for love and not for show, moves people more than any splendor. And by the turn of the year the story that ran the drawing rooms of 3 counties was not the Duke abandoned, but the Duke who owned his fault, and the further tale, brought by tenants to market and by servants to servants, of the same Duke sitting now in the almshouse of a Sunday, and reading the Psalms to a blind old woman, and paying a schoolboy's fees with his own hand, the Marchioness of Combe, whom Lady Pentrith had promised so much sport, was heard to say that she had always thought nor hoped for cold fish, and was pleased to be proved wrong, and that a man who could be brought to his knees by a good woman was worth 10 who had never knelt to anyone, which is the sort of thing marchionesses say, and it went round. And it did the Duke's name more good than 100 subscriptions, none of which Osmar sought or severed, for he had stopped that autumn living for the county at all. But it reached Millbrook, as such things do, and it reached it by an awkward door, in the person of Mr. Fenwick Aldecott. Mr. Aldecott was a widowed gentleman of Millbrook, comfortable and kind and dull, who had known Olwenna's family in her girlhood, and had once, before the Duke's man of business ever crossed her uncle's threshold, entertained a mild hope in her direction, a hope long since folded away, but not so far away that the return of the Duchess to Millbrook, and the loud county rumour that her great marriage was foundering, could not shake it loose again. He called. He was correct and gentle. He called again, and on his 3rd calling, walking Olwenna along the harbour arm in the cold, bright noon with her aunt's blessing and his own courage screwed up, he made her, very delicately, An offer that was not quite an offer, spoke of the hardness of a great cold marriage, and the sweetness of a small warm one, and of an establishment at Millbrook near her aunt, quiet and kindly and free of ducal chill, should she ever find herself, as it were, at liberty. He was not a bad man, he meant it as a rescue. He had heard she was ill-used and wished gently to be her ease. And Olwenna, standing on the harbour arm with the grey sea heaving beyond the stones and a good, dull, kindly man offering her exactly the safe small warmth she had once wept for on a bench under the piers, discovered in that instant, past all further doubt, what she felt, because the whole of her recoiled from it, not from Mr. Aldecott, who deserved no recoil, from the offer, from the smallness of it. She had spent 6 years being asked to be small, and had folded herself away to oblige, and here was smallness held out to her now as a kindness, a snug harbour, a life with no cold springs in it and no risk, and no man who had ever frozen her, and no man either who had ever knelt at her cold grate and built a fire with unpractised hands, or planted a pier he could not live to see fruit, or written her across 3 counties about the 42nd Psalm and never once said come home. She did not want the safe harbour. She wanted the man who had nearly lost her and was learning, in the losing, to turn his head. She wanted the risk, because the risk was where the love was. Her aunt had told her so, and she had known it in her own bones for weeks. "You are very good, Mr. Aldecott," she said gently, "and I shall value your friendship all my life. But I am not at liberty, and I am not ill-used, whatever the county says, and I hope to be less at liberty still very soon. I have a husband. He was a long time learning to be one. But he is learning, and I find I do not want to be rescued from him. I want to go home to him and finish what we have scarcely begun." And she said it, and heard herself say it, and knew it for the truth she had come counties to find, and turned her face into the sea wind, so that the good dull man should not see how it had shaken her to learn her own heart at last, out loud. On a cold stone pier, she went home to her aunt's fire that afternoon, resolved to write it, to write Ozma the letter she had been too proud and too frightened to write, to tell him she was coming home, that the miles had done their work, and the work had come out in his favour, that she had chosen him with every door in the world standing open. She got as far as "My dear Osmar," and sat with the pen dry above the paper, smiling at nothing, too full to write, and decided she would finish it in the morning when she was calmer. In the morning the letter from Harrow came instead. It was brief, and it was grave, and it was not the steward's usual gentle bulletin of the parish. The fever had come back to the low village, it said, the same fever of 3 springs past, out of the wet ground and the crowded River Row cottages, and it was going hard. And it had taken the Marley twins first, grown now but struck down cruel, and was spreading cottage by cottage. And the Duke, it said, had not gone to London as he had done 3 springs before, but had sent for broth and linen and gone down into the village himself, and had been nursing there, hand to hand, this 6 days and more, and would not be got out of it. And Harrow was uneasy in his mind, for his Grace did not spare himself, and there was fever in a house that a man may carry out of it in his own blood before he knows he has it. "I thought your Grace should know," the old man had written, being his wife, and knowing him, I think, better now than she may believe. Olwenna read it standing in the narrow spare room with the sea sounding under the window, and she did not finish the letter she had begun to write. She did not need it now. The words she had been too proud to set on paper she would say to his face, if there was still a face to say them to, and she folded Harrow's letter with hands that did not shake, because she had stopped in that instant, being afraid. Fear being a thing one can afford on when there is time for it, and she went and told her aunt she was going home, and her aunt looked at her a moment and said only, "Take the mail, it is faster than waiting on any carriage, and go now, and God speed you, girl. The bad bargain has come good, and you'll not want to lose it at the last for a day's delay." And Olwenna kissed her, and did not stop to pack the trunk, and went down the cobbled hill to the coaching inn in the grey morning to buy her passage north, toward Norhope, and the fever, and the frozen man who had gone down into the cottages at last and might, even now, be carrying death home in his blood for the love of parish she had taught him how to love. He nursed for 11 days, the Duke of Norhope, who had never in his life carried his own coal, carried broth and water and soiled linen up and down the River Row in the rain, and sat by the beds of tenants whose names he had made himself learn at last, and held the hands of the frightened and closed the eyes of the two who could not be saved, and gave the physician a free hand and paid for everything and slept, when he slept, 3 hours at a stretch on a settle in the Marley's kitchen. He was not splendid. There was no audience for splendor, only the sick and the exhausted, and half of them too fevered to know a duke tended them. He did it because it wanted doing, and there was no one else of his rank to do it, and because he understood dimly through his own wariness. It was what she would have done, and doing it was a way of being near her across the miles, and a way of being, for the first time in his life, the man he might have been all along if grief had not frozen him young. He did not write to Olwen about it. It did not occur to him too. That was the measure of the change. 3 months before, he could not have resisted the letter. See how I have changed, see me nurse the poor. Now it simply did not enter his head, because he was not doing it for her to see. Harrow wrote to her, though. The old steward, unbidden, took up his pen and told the Duchess plainly what her husband was about, because he said afterward, some things a wife has a right to know whether her husband thinks to tell her or no. And on the 11th day, when the fever had begun at last to loose its grip on the village, and the worst was passing, it took hold of the Duke. He had felt it coming and had told no one. Had gone on carrying and lifting through the first hot ache of it, because there was still work and no one to spare, and it was the physician who found him, at last, grey and swaying against the door-frame of the Marley cottage, and put a hand to his brow and swore, and had him carried up to the great house by 4 frightened men through the rain. By nightfall he was raving. The fever went hard into a strong man who had spent himself past his reserves. And for 3 days it was not at all certain that the Duke of Norhope would see the spring, and the physician, grave, sent word to the Duchess at Millbrook that she should come if she wished to come in time, not knowing that she was already 3 counties nearer than his letter, on the North Road, in a rocking mail coach, having set out the very morning of the day the fever took her husband, upon a graver letter of Harrow's than the physician's would ever be. She had left Millbrook, then, not knowing he was ill, only that he had gone down among the fever cottages, and would not be got out, and that a man may carry death out of such a place in his own blood, and she drove day and night against that fear, and it was on the road, at a change of horses in a wet grey market town, that the physician's letter overtook her, forwarded post-haste from her aunt's hand, and told her the fear had come true. She read it under the inn-yard lamp, and did not weep and did not falter, only paid the ostler double to be quick with the fresh team, and drove on. She came into Norhope in the black hours grey with sleeplessness, and did not stop to take off her travelling cloak, but went straight up the great stair, the stair where he had once thanked her as a footman, and into the room where he lay. And she sent the tired nurses to their beds and took the chair by the bed herself, and she did not leave it for 4 days. He did not know she was there at first. He was far down in the fever, in the country where the dead walk, and he talked to them to Aldous, over and over, arguing with him about the horse, begging him not to ride it, to his father in the chair by the window. And then, on the 2nd night, the pattern of his raving changed, and Olwenna, holding his hot hand in the candlelight, heard her own name. He was apologizing. Even in the depths of the fever, even out of his own mind, the Duke of Norhope was apologizing to his wife for the peers, he said. Over and over, for the peers, I did not know you sat there, I did not know you sat anywhere, and for the cold room, and for 6 years of mornings he had not turned his head. I can be here, he told the dark, urgently, gripping her hand without knowing it was hers. Tell her I can be here. Not splendid, only here. Tell her I learned the difference. Tell her about the pear tree, it has 3 leaves. And then he was lost again in the dark country, calling for his brother, and Olwenna Netherby, Duchess of Norhope, who had come north telling herself she came only out of common humanity. One does not let even a man one is leaving die alone, put her face down against her husband's fevered hand in the candlelight, and understood that she had been lying to herself the whole of the journey, and wept as she had not let herself weep in 6 years, not the quiet folding away tears of the trunk, but the deep and ruinous weeping of a person who has just discovered, too late perhaps, that a thing she had let go all the way out is not out at all, but only banked, and needs only breath to leap. You are here, she whispered to him, though he could not hear. You foolish, frozen dear man. You went and made yourself worth staying for at last, and you did it where I could not see, which is the only way I would ever have believed it. And now you will not dare to die and leave me having found it out. Do you hear me, Osmar? You have wasted 6 years of my life, and I will not have you waste the rest of it by dying in the 1 week I decided to keep you. I forbid it. I am a duchess. I forbid it. Whether it was her voice, or the physician's bark, or only the turning that fevers take of their own accord in the dark hours, the crisis broke before dawn on the 4th day. The heat went out of him all at once in a drenching sweat, and his breathing lengthened and eased. And near sunrise he opened his eyes, clear, exhausted, his own, and found his wife's face above him in the grey light, worn to the bone and streaked with weeping and more beautiful than anything he had seen in the country of the dead. And he thought at first she was another fever vision and closed his eyes again against the cruelty of it. No, she said, and gripped his hand hard enough to hurt, so that he would know it was real. No, Osmar, open your eyes. I am here. It is Olwenna. I am here, and I am real, and I am not a dream, and you are going to live. He opened his eyes. He looked at her hand in his and up at her face, and something broke in the ice of him that had been breaking for 3 months and now at last gave way entire. You came, he said. His voice was a cinder. I did not write. I did not want you to come out of pity, out of duty. You should not have the fever. Harrow wrote to me. And I did not come out of duty, you impossible man. She was laughing and weeping at once now, pressing his cold hand to her wet cheek. I came because in the 8th week I read a letter about the 42nd Psalm and a pear tree with 3 leaves, and I sat by the sea at Millbrook, and I knew that I had my answer and had had it for weeks, and was too proud and too frightened to write it. And then Harrow's letter came saying you were nursing the poor in the rain like a common man, and then that you were dying, and I understood that I had very nearly done again the thing I have spent my life doing, which is to fold a precious thing away small and quiet until it is too late to unfold it, and I will not. I am done being quiet, Osmar. I am done folding myself into trunks. She kissed his knuckles fiercely. I am staying. Do you hear me? Not because you trapped me, you set me perfectly free, you gave me every door, but because with every door in the world standing open, this is the one I choose, you. This cold, dear thawing house, the pear tree. I choose it. I came back to tell you, and you had the great impertinence to be nearly dead. He could not speak. He lay looking up at her, at his wife's face wet and fierce and alight in the sunrise, and he lifted his other hand. It took the whole of his fevered strength, and laid it against her cheek. The first time in 6 years he had touched her face, and she turned her head and pressed her lips to his palm, and neither of them said anything for a long while, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already understood between the two of them at last. In the clean, grey light of the morning the fever broke. The news that the fever had loosed the Duke ran through Norhope before the sun was well up, carried from the sick-room by a weeping housemaid to the kitchen, and from the kitchen out to the stables and the low village. And by mid-morning the whole of the parish that had feared for the man who came down among them in the rain knew that he would live, and knew too, for servants know everything, and had known it before the master did, that the Duchess was come home and sitting by his bed and had not stirred from it, and that whatever had been broken between the great pair was mending along with the Duke's own blood. Olwenna would not leave him even to sleep in a bed. She dozed in the chair with her hand in his and woke at every change in his breathing, and the physician, coming and going, gave up telling her to rest and instead brought a second cushion and said only that a wife's watching had cured more men than his own draughts ever had, and that he had never in 30 years' practice seen a duke so plainly determined to live for the sake of the woman holding his hand. Osmar slept the long healing sleep the fever spent, and each time he surfaced from it she was there, and each time he looked at her as a man looks who is not yet sure the world has been given back to him and dares not believe it, and each time she took his hand to her chest. Still here. I am still here. Go back to sleep, until the disbelief in his face began by the 3rd day to give way to something quieter and steadier, which was the beginning of trust. On the 4th day he was strong enough to sit up against the pillows and take broth from her own hand, and to talk a little. And it was then, in the grey afternoon light with the fire she had kept bank burning low in the grate, that they said the plain things at last, awake and clear-eyed, that had only been said before in the delirium and by the sea. "You were going to write to me," he said. His voice was still a ruin, but his eyes were his own. "Before Harrow's letter. You told me, the first night, though I do not think you knew I heard. You said you had begun a letter and never finished it." "I did not finish it," she said, "because I decided I would rather say it to your face, and then you had the great impertinence to be nearly dead before I could." She set down the broth. "So I will say it now, and you will please have the courtesy to remember it and not lay it to the fever afterward. I am staying, Osmar. Not because you nearly died and pity moved me. Pity would have had me nurse you and go home to Millbrook after, and I am not going home to Millbrook. I am home. I went 3 counties away to be certain, and I got my certainty, and it is this, that with every door in the world standing open, and a good kind man at Millbrook holding one of them wide and offering me a snug small life with no cold springs in it. I looked at all of it, and I only the frozen difficult man who planted me a pear tree he might not live to taste and wrote me across 3 counties about the water brooks, not once, told me to come home." Her voice thickened. "You gave me the choosing, so I have chosen. I choose you. I would like it entered in the record, Your Grace, that the Duchess of Norhope chose to stay freely, and may not hereafter be told she was trapped into it by you or by anyone, herself included on her low days. I choose you." He was quiet a long moment, and she saw the old ice make one last reach for him, the flinch of a man who has trained himself for 40 years to distrust anything that could be lost, and she saw him this time refuse it, saw him deliberately not go hard and silent, but stay present in the open, exactly as his dying mother had begged his father to do, exactly as he had at last learned to do himself. "Then I choose you also," he said, which I should have said in a church 6 years ago and did not, because I was 3 counties away in a churchyard and thought I was being sensible. "I choose you, Olwenna, awake in my own mind with nothing owing and no fortnight and no siege, the way you made me learn to do it. I will not tell you I shall never be cold again, for I was 40 years learning the cold, and I will be unlearning it the rest of my life, and there will be grey mornings when the old ice reaches for me, and I go quiet and shut. But I give you leave, I ask it of you, to come and sit by me on those mornings and take my hand and wait, and not let me vanish behind the wall as I used to. That is the whole of what I can promise. Not that I will never be cold, that I will always, always come back to you from it, every time. Especially when it is hard, especially when it is hard," she repeated and smiled through her tears, for she did not know he had read those words in his mother's letter, and he did not tell her yet, only kept them a small warm secret to give her later. "Yes. That is a better promise than never being cold. I do not want a man who has never been cold. I want the one who comes back." The trunk was still in the west room where she had packed it 3 counties worth of resolution ago. She had never fully unpacked it at Millbrook, and it had come home with her, and it stood now against the wall of the chamber where he lay, the leather lid down but not locked. On the 5th day, when he could rise and sit in a chair by the window wrapped in a dressing gown with the winter sun on him, she went to it and opened it and began, before his eyes, to unpack it, the grey shawl, the linen, the prayer book with the pressed blossom in it, the little enamelled box her mother had left her, and to put each thing away, this time, in the presses and the drawers of a room that would be warm now and stay warm, that would be theirs. She did it slowly, and he watched her do it, and neither of them spoke. And it was the exact undoing of the grey afternoon when he had found her folding her life into it in silence. The same small sounds, the same smoothing of the linen with the side of her hand, but running now the other way, unfolding, unpacking, coming home instead of going. And it undid him almost as much to watch the unpacking as the packing had. But this time the thing rising in his throat was not dread. "I never gave you the speech," she said, near the bottom of the trunk, half to herself. "What speech?" "I had one ready. The first day in the great hall, when I came to Norhope, a frightened girl of 20. I had a whole speech ready, to be a good wife, to try to make you glad of me, all of it, and you walked past me to read a letter about a marsh. And I put the speech away and never took it out again in 6 years. She lifted the last thing from the trunk, closed the empty lid and turned to him, and her eyes were wet and bright. I have forgotten most of it. But it began, I mean to make you glad you married me, and I never got to say it, and I find I still mean it 6 years and 3 counties late. I mean to make you glad you married me, Osmar. Better late than never. That is the whole of the speech I can remember. And the Duke of Norhope, who had never in his adult life let anyone see him weep, wept then, openly, sitting in a dressing gown in a sunlit chair with his wife's emptied trunk between them, and held out his hand to her, and she came and knelt by the chair and let him hold her, and he said, when he could speak, I have been glad I married you since the afternoon I found you at that trunk, and ashamed that it took the losing of you to make me glad, and I will spend the rest of my life being glad of you out loud every day, so that you never again have to fold a speech away unsaid. You will be so tired of hearing how glad I am, I promise you that. It is the one promise I am wholly certain I can keep. Word of it all went out through the house and the parish in the way such things do, softened and multiplied in the telling, and old Mrs. Thorpe, blind by a fire, was heard to say she had known it would come right, for she had heard the Duke's step stop at her door at last, and a step that learns to stop is a step that has learned to stay, and Harrow, the old steward who had written the graver letter that brought the Duchess home, took a quiet, unservant-like satisfaction in his part in it, and was forgiven at last by himself, for the 3 years he had kept the Duchess's secrets from a master who never asked. And a letter went south to Millbrook to a sharp old woman by a small fire, that made her set down her mending and look into the flames a while and say to the empty room, well, the bad bargain came good after all. I said it would. I only wish I had a wager on it, for I should be rich. And she wrote back one line, which Olwenna kept. I always liked a bad bargain that came good. Stay and make him work for it, and do not, whatever else you do, forget how to use your own judgment. It was the best thing anyone had of me. He mended slowly, and she nursed him, and it was in the mending that the real marriage began, not in the fever's high drama, but in the long, ordinary convalescent day after, which were the very 6,000 small mornings she had told him she doubted, arriving one after another for the 2 of them to fill. She would not let him rush it. He was a man accustomed to command his own body as he commanded everything else, and it galled him to be weak, and the first time he tried to rise too soon and take up the reins of the estate, she put him back against the pillows with one firm hand and said, no. You spent yourself hollow for those cottages, and you will let yourself be filled again before you are any use to me or to them. You have spent 6 years being strong for no one. You may spend 6 weeks being weak for me. It is my turn to tend, and yours to be tended, and you will bear it, Osmar. If it kills you, which it will not, because I forbade that also. And he lay back, and bore it, and discovered that to be cared for by a person who has chosen to care for you is a thing he had not known since he was a boy, and that he had built the whole fortress of his coldness precisely to keep from ever needing it, and that needing it, now, with her, did not destroy him as he had always feared. It healed him. The needing was the healing. They talked, in those weeks, as they had begun to talk on the road to Millbrook and in the letters, but deeper now, with the fever burned between them like a fire that clears the ground. He told her the rest of it. The boyhood, the frozen father, the second son who had never expected the weight and had taken it up graceless and alone. She told him her own small history that he had never once asked for in 6 years, the country parsonage she had come from, the mother dead when she was 15, the uncle who had married her off to a duke because it was a great match and asked no one whether it was a kind one, the girlhood among books and hedgerows that had made her the quiet, watchful woman she was. He listened, sitting up against the pillows with the winter light on the grey at his temples, and asked her the small questions a husband asks who means to keep a thing by heart. The name of the parsonage cat, the hen her mother had liked, the hedgerow where she had first learned the flowers she later taught him in his own garden, and she answered, marvelling, for no one had ever wanted the small furniture of her before, and she understood that being wanted in the small things is the whole of what she had gone 6 years without, and that he had learned it at last, and meant to make up the arrears of it a question at a time. I mean to know you now, he said, when the light had gone and the fire was all that lit the room, all of it, down to the parsonage cat, if it takes me the rest of my life. I have 30,000 small mornings of you to catch up on, and I intend to be greedy about it. He did try. That was the thing she had doubted most, and it was the thing he proved not in a fortnight but in the slow accumulating years, that the change was not the fever vow of a dying man but the settled turning of a life. He did not become, overnight, a warm and easy man. He had been 40 years learning coldness, and he unlearned it by inches, and there were mornings still, especially in the grey autumns near the anniversary of his brother's death, when the old ice reached for him and he would go silent and shut. And she learned the signs of it and did not let him vanish behind the wall as he once had. She would come and sit by him and put her hand over his and say nothing, only be there, and by he would come back to her out of the cold country, and the coming back grew easier each year, because there was each year more to come back to. The piers were the calendar of it. The little tree he had planted in the corner where the old ones stood grew as pear trees grow, slowly and then all at once. She pruned it with the same shears she used on the old climbing rose, and he learned to do it too, standing behind her in the walled garden with his hands over hands on the shears while she taught him, which was an excuse, and they both knew it. The first spring after the fever it flowered, a few brave white blossoms, and she cut one and pressed it in the prayer book that had gone into the trunk and come out of it. The second spring it flowered more. The third it set fruit that fell green and hard and inedible, and they were absurdly proud of it. And in the fourth year, 4 years, almost to the season, from the night he had knelt at her cold grate and said, "I shall have to be here in 4 years to eat one," the tree bore true. A dozen small golden pears warm from the south wall, and Osmer of Norhope picked the first of them with his own hand and brought it to his wife on the oak bench beneath the tree, where she sat with a book in the 1 hour before the house woke, the hour that was hers, that he had learned to guard for her as fiercely as she had once guarded her own smallness. He did not make a speech. He had learned that too. He only sat beside her on the bench and put pear in her hand and said, "I told you I should have to be here." Olwenna turned the warm fruit in her fingers, and looked at it, and looked at him, at the grey coming in at his temples now, at the lines the years and the loving had put around his dark eyes, at the man who had knelt to build a fire in a cold room the day she meant to leave him and had never, in the end, let it go out again, and her own eyes filled. "You have been here," she said, "every morning, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. Do you know, I have stopped counting them. I used to count the mornings you did not turn your head. I gave up the counting somewhere in the 2nd year, and I only noticed just now that I had. That is how I know it is real, Osmar. Not because you are splendid, because I have stopped keeping the account." He took her hand, the one not holding the pear, and turned it and pressed his lips to the palm, the old gesture that had become theirs, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together on the bench under the pear tree in the first light while the house slept, an old married pair now to look at them, comfortable, unremarkable, the kind of couple a stranger's eye would pass over without a second glance, and never guess the country they had crossed to arrive at so ordinary a peace. The trunk was long gone. She had had it carried up to the box room in the 2nd year and packed away with the summer linen, and once, going up for something, he had come upon it and stood a while with his hand on the worn leather lid, remembering the grey afternoon and the folded shawl and the empty grate and the whole of what he had so nearly, so deservedly, lost. And he had gone down and found her in the garden and taken her in his arms without a word, in the middle of the day, in full view of 2 gardeners and a scandalized maid, and held her until she laughed and asked him whatever was the matter, and he had said, "Nothing. Nothing is the matter." That is the whole of the wonder of it. Nothing is the matter, and it might so easily have been everything, and she had understood, and stopped laughing and held him back. They were not childless in the end, though that is another story and a gentler one. And the pear tree and the walled garden filled in the fullness of years with small feet and small voices, and old Mrs. Thorpe lived long enough to hear them, and to be read to still every Friday by one or the other of them, and the almshouse never wanted for coals. And the parish that had loved the quiet duchess in the margins came in time to love the duke as well, the Thord Duke, the one who stopped at doors now, who was known to carry his own coal in a hard year, and to sit up in the cottages when the fever came, as it came again more than once, and never took from them a soul he set himself to nurse. But the peers were the heart of it always. Every summer, to the end of their long lives together, he brought her the first ripe pear of the tree on the oak bench in the 1 hour before the house woke, and put it in her hand, and said the same 4 words, "I told you so," or "I am here still," or once, when they were very old and she was ill and he was afraid, only her name, twice, which said the same thing, and every summer she took it, and leaned her grey head against his shoulder, and forgave him again, freely, though there had long been nothing left to forgive, only the deep and daily miracle of a man who had turned his head at last, in time, and a woman who had unfolded herself from a trunk and let herself be loved. He had ignored her for years. He had found her packing her trunk in complete silence, on a grey afternoon, in a cold room he had never troubled to enter, and had broken him, as it deserved to, and out of the breaking he had built, slowly, with his own unpractised hands, the one thing his whole cold, clever life had never given him, and his whole cold, clever life had been designed to avoid: a marriage worth the risk of losing, and a woman worth the losing of his fear, and a small golden pear, warm from the south wall, in the palm of the only hand he had ever wanted to hold. He never let it go again, not once, in all the years that were left to them, and they were many, and they were warm, and there was never again a cold room in the whole of Nor Hope that anyone forgot to light.